Welcome to Voice for Infection Prevention, where we explore the latest developments, challenges, and insights in the field of infection prevention and control. With a passion for promoting patient safety and healthcare excellence, we're excited to bring you engaging discussions with experts, leaders, and innovators in the field. So whether you're a seasoned professional or just beginning your journey in infection prevention, welcome to the conversation. This is Voice for Infection Prevention.
Welcome back to Voice for Infection Prevention. Today I'm sitting down with Krystal Robinson, a dynamic leader in infection prevention with over 15 years of experience in the field. Krystal's journey began in public health and health disparities research with an initial goal of working in healthcare policy. But after shadowing an infection preventionist, she discovered a career that blended science, leadership, and patient safety, launching her into a path of mentorship, advocacy, and system-wide infection prevention leadership. In this conversation, Krystal shares how she navigated the field without a clinical background, why she pursued her CIC certification early on, and how she grew from a staff-level infection preventionist to overseeing infection prevention across multiple hospitals. We also dive into her passion for health equity and infection prevention, discussing how socioeconomic factors impact infection rates and what hospitals can do to bridge that gap. If you're interested in career growth, leadership development, or the future of infection prevention, this is a conversation you'll want to listen to. Let's dive in.
This episode is sponsored by Clutch Recruitment, the leading recruiting firm in the country, recruiting exclusively within infection prevention and control.
All right. Cool. Well, I just want to jump right in, and I'll start it off the same way that I've done with all of these podcasts so far. But I'm curious how you discovered infection prevention. Was this an area that you kind of fell into like most people, or did you go to school planning on doing it? Just how did you discover this as a career?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in infection prevention for going on 15 years now. And a little bit of my background. So I did health disparities research straight out of undergrad. And then I went into teaching at like kind of an inner city school in Houston. And I taught health, advanced health, and wrote health curriculum for the school district. And then when I was in that position, I earned my master's in public health with the emphasis on public policy. So when I finished my MPH, my thought was that I wanted to go into healthcare to impact the health disparities that I was seeing, to be able to support the improvement of the structures that I was seeing were challenging in terms of what I learned when I was teaching kids, and their families were in hospitals and they were getting diagnoses and things like that. And around that time, I started applying for positions. And because I, of course, had my MPH, I was looking for positions that came up with that requirement, and infection prevention came up. And it was something that had this particular organization not acknowledged the appropriateness of an MPH background in infection prevention, I never would have gotten into it. That's still somewhat of a rarity. It's usually a nursing degree. And so I applied, they called me, and then they offered a shadowing opportunity and just fell in love from there, and have been there the last decade and a half.
Okay. And I typically don't do this, but I want to ask specifically about this organization. So it's Infection Prevention and Management Associates. And the reason why I want to ask about it is because as a recruiting firm, everyone, and I've met a lot of people that have come out of this organization, everyone just seems so well-rounded and just very, very, very strong in infection prevention and ready to take on any role. So I want to know, just tell me about that position, what it was like working for them, because they're doing something right, because it feels like everybody that comes out of there really just understands and what infection prevention is and is able to make a pretty quick impact.
Yeah. I really think what worked well for me while within that organization was the support, and that the blueprint was already written. So, sometimes you come into infection prevention and you're a solo IP, or you're two-person team that reports to a non-certified, like non-veteran infection prevention leader, and you're just figuring it out as you go. So it was the fact that there was already a structure, there were already veterans in the field, probably even at that point, hundreds of years of experience. And so you were falling in line with what was established and able to really immerse yourself in studying for your CIC, really applying the principles. It was almost like school a little bit, right? Like learning in modules, testing as you go along. So it's just very structured. And I think oftentimes when you're new to IP, it just feels like drinking through a water hose. And some people have a hard time with that or don't survive that. So I think this was a very structured entry into infection prevention.
Great. And what did that first role look like for you? Was that at a hospital or a clinic? I mean, I've seen different things,
Yeah.
but what was your first position there?
I'm trying to remember, where was I?
Yeah.
It was at a hospital. And I think there were two other infection preventionists. I think there were three of us at that time. And so each of us at different points in our career, and then with essentially like preceptors that supported us, that were coming in, kind of introducing new concepts to us and coaching us through challenging situations.
Excellent. And do you remember what the background of the other two IPs were? Were they non-nurses as well, or were they?
I believe they were.
Okay.
I believe they were. I'm a little hazy now, but yeah.
Yeah, it's been a minute, so that makes sense. So they put you straight into a hospital with other IPs then, and you mentioned that they really set you up to get your CSC. How long were you working in infection prevention before you studied and passed that test?
Back then, it was that 2-year mark that they recommended not taking it before then. So it was right at that 2-year mark, I recall, because I was pregnant with my first daughter. And so I was like, let me do this before I go on maternity leave and have the baby. So it was right at that mark.
Gotcha. And then was that a challenging test for you, or were you, when the 2-year mark hit, were you ready to go?
Personally, I think I'm a pretty good test taker, so I didn't find it particularly challenging. But I also think, like I said, it was a very structured training in infection prevention, so nothing was unfamiliar to me going into that test. There are areas I was stronger, areas I was less strong, but I was familiar with it all.
Okay. And then you did it, and you were with that organization for 4 years, it looks like. So I'm curious, when did you feel confident in the role? I mean, when did you feel like you were appropriately the point person for infection prevention there?
I would say probably in that second year, you start to realize, some things, right? That even though it feels like you might be ill-equipped, you're able to see in different conversations that you're having that you really do have a different understanding, a different perspective that adds value to the conversation. So I would say definitely within that second year, and then obtaining your certification really solidifies that. I think it gives you something to hang your hat on, and it's an objective measure. So it's not just someone saying you're great, like it's you understanding that. So I would say around that second year.
There's not and it's becoming more common, but there's not a ton of IPs, especially staff level, that have their master's degree going in. So I'm curious, did you really feel like the master's degree really prepared you to do well, or is that just kind of some letters next to your name that didn't really add much? Or how much value do you put in that master's degree then and now, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question. Foundationally, I think it allowed me to be prepared with some of the concepts that would be more introduced during the role, like entering into the role. So, statistics at a deeper level than in your undergrad degree, public health concepts, community health concepts, epidemiology, right, is a component of your master's of public health. So I wouldn't say it's the be all end all if you don't have it, but I certainly think that having it is in line with this career path and helpful.
Gotcha. And then you mentioned, you got an MPH and you had your bachelor's in health science before that. So no real clinical experience before jumping into this role, which is often an area that people just have to learn. How quickly did you learn the clinical piece?
I would say, I guess there's doing and then there's a command for what you're doing, right? And it's two different things. So within a few months, I'm rounding on patients with devices. We're having conversations about surgical site infections. You're applying those NHSN definitions that require you to be able to have those conversations. But I think it's been an evolution of having a depth of knowledge that allows me to lead and work with multidisciplinary groups to have stronger outcomes and strengthen process improvement efforts. That's probably what I would say. I mean, yeah, because you're rounding, and at first you just have your checklist and you're like asking this question, and then based on their answer, you're making a recommendation, right? But you're not maybe equipped to push back or challenge that decision, especially if you're talking about challenging a physician. So I think that's where just time in the field, you grow in your ability to have those conversations and push a little bit on things that maybe earlier in your career you would just accept.
Yeah. And how did you go about actually learning the clinical piece? I mean, you mentioned you had a lot of support there, but how specifically the clinical aspects, how did you really learn that and get to the point to where you felt comfortable challenging some of those leaders?
So part of it, I mean, outside of just general training, like on the job training and reading, I think it's having conversations with clinicians that were open and willing to see you as a partner and someone that it's important to make sure you understand. And some people aren't, right? Like you're in your role, they're in their role, and you're each just doing your task. But there are people that take you under their wing and you feel comfortable saying, like, I really need to understand, like, what's the difference in these bore sizes? Or, why does the number of lumens matter? Or can you let me watch you do this so I can really understand? And so I think that's really important, is finding those people who are open and supportive and want you to be successful in your role so that you can partner together.
Gotcha. And then while you were at that organization, were you on the staff level the entire 4 years, or did you jump around to different positions with that organization?
No, I would say I was on what would be the staff level. You kind of sometimes move between different campuses or organizations. So it depends on how many people are there. Like I've trained people when I was in that organization, but title wise or direct, like having direct reports, that's all pretty much the same the whole time.
Gotcha. And then after those 4 years, you transitioned to a different health system. First time with truly employed by a health system, it looks like. Did you jump straight into a leadership role, or did you go in as a staff person?
Straight into a leadership role, and I felt equipped to do so. I think the structure of the previous organization had given me that experience. I just formally didn't have direct reports, So I felt prepared to do that. I remember being surprised because I was going to my hometown. That position was back in my hometown. And I thought I was going to be at one hospital, and then on the interview learned that it was over the region, and it would be several hospitals. But I think it was fortuitous because I was ready for that, and it was a great transition.
So, okay, talk to me for a second about this, because this is an unheard of jump in the field. I mean, from what I've seen, like it does not happen very often at all, where somebody goes from a staff level position, or at least a staff title, up to a regional director of a health system over 3 hospitals, no less. So you had to sell yourself really well. And like, obviously you've hinted at it. I mean, you had some kind of leadership within the organization, and we're doing some things, but still, I mean, a natural progression that you see is maybe somebody will go be a sole preventionist and run a program at a small facility for a few years, or maybe be a manager with a couple of direct reports. You kind of jump several steps to get up to this regional director role. So how did you, I've got 2 questions here. One, how did you sell yourself on an interview to get that job? Because clearly you weren't just ready for it, but you convinced somebody you were ready for it, even though your resume may not specifically lay that out. So I want to know how you sold yourself, but then also, what did you do while you had the staff level title that prepared you for that next step that you took?
Yeah. I'll answer the second question first. So what I did, I think, is towards the end of my time with that organization, I started doing a lot more process improvement work, started having conversations with more higher level, senior level leaders, trying to think more strategically about our long term goals, and stopped or transitioned away, I should say, from being so task focused on this has to happen today, this has to happen tomorrow, but more how do we achieve outcomes that are for the betterment of the organization, for the betterment of patient safety, really leaning into the more patient safety quality side of the work. And I think going into that interview, being able to speak to that, being able to understand more of the big picture and how infection prevention adds value to a healthcare organization's quality and safety strategic goals is really important.
No, that's amazing that you were able to do that. But let's talk then your day-to-day work. I mean, because being a ground level staff IP, jumping up to a regional director, I mean, your day-to-day has to look totally different, I imagine. Or were you still a kind of a worker bee at the same time? What did that regional director role look like?
Well, I think in infection prevention, often you're a working leader, right? Like you're often doing part of the work, because that's just staffing dependent. And I think a desire to support your team and need to understand your team's processes. So when I moved to that regional leader position, I was still very involved in the day to day. Definitely had a great team there, and they were doing a lot of the work, absolutely. But I think having just come from a staff position, I was still very comfortable as well. And it was completely different systems, completely different processes. So I think in my time there, I transitioned away from that a little bit, but in the beginning, very much involved so that I understood what was going on and the processes that I was bringing in or recommending, making sure that they were appropriate.
Gotcha. And then was there any hesitation at all from the health system to hire a non-nurse?
Not that they shared with me. If
Yeah.
they had internal conversations, I mean, I imagine they discussed it, but not that they shared with me or asked me to explain or convince them of my value, which I obviously greatly appreciated and made that feel like that was a right move for me.
Yeah, for sure. And when you got in, were people, I mean, did they have non-nurses on the team, or were you the first non-clinical person? Or I guess I'm just wondering if there was, maybe not on the interview process, maybe not the person that hired you, but when you're interacting with physicians, I mean, was there anybody that was more hesitant to trust you with the background that you had, or was there just an assumption that you were a nurse, or what was that dynamic like?
Gosh, I'm trying to remember. So I think the hiring team, everyone was familiar with my background and they had no concerns. When I got onto the team or, the quality leadership team, it was predominantly nurses that were in the IP roles. I am a big proponent, obviously, because of my background, that you don't need to be a nurse to be successful in infection prevention. And I think a team is the strongest when there's diversity. I want lab tech background, nursing background, respiratory therapy background. I want all of those perspectives at the table. And so in my time there, we did bring in non-nurses and start to diversify the professional background.
Gotcha. Was it difficult for you to be over multiple health systems, multiple hospitals? Because I know you bounced around and you kind of did different things when you were at the former position. So you probably worked in different facilities that had different cultures. But managing multiple hospitals that had their own individual cultures, was that how much of a challenge was that for you to get kind of everybody on the same page and just realize that there's probably different processes for different hospitals within the same system?
I don't feel like that was so much difficult as something very logistical. Where you office makes a big
Yeah.
difference. And I officed at one of the hospitals. And so what
Gotcha.
I found is that you are associated with that facility and you're seen as essentially like a FTE or resource specifically for that facility, even though you might have responsibilities throughout a larger number sites. And so I think that was the biggest challenge. You get in and you kind of learn the C-suite kind of interactions at each campus, their strengths, their weaknesses, their patient populations. So that just takes time. But I think it's where you spend your time that really matters and impacts how people see you.
Gotcha. So then you said you were based, like your office was at the main facility there. Did you find yourself going to the other campuses often, or did you kind of have point people that you more or less relied on to do the work there? Or how often were you on different campuses?
Yeah, I feel like I was there pretty often. I mean, it depends because you have fires, right? So if you're having a situation somewhere, infrastructure challenge or outbreak situation, you're going to spend more time there. But I would rotate and visit and round with the IPs at all the different campuses. But again, I would spend the most time where my office was.
Yeah.
So you really have to be very deliberate when you're assigned to multiple campuses about how you spend your time and probably overly explanatory to the leaders at that site of how those decisions are made or how those determinations are made, and making sure when you're there, you are out and about, not just sitting in an office somewhere working from a different site because they want to see you.
Yeah. And let me take a step back because I left something out that I'm curious about. But when you applied for the role because it kind of met your background, this is back your initial position. When you started working as an infection preventionist, was there anything that you came across where you're like, oh wow, I did not realize that would be my job, or I didn't realize I would be responsible for that? Was there anything that you remember that's like it's kind of an eye-opening moment that it's like, oh wow, that's my job too?
Yeah. I think it would be the non-patient facing responsibilities that actually end up taking a lot of the time. So the issues with the HVAC system, the issues with plumbing, taking a really strong role in the development and monitoring of a water management plan. I know what dead legs are in facilities, and I understand temperatures and cutoffs and all those different things. And that isn't usually what's talked about in an interview. And so not realizing how much of our time would be spent on infrastructure, construction, renovation. Yeah.
Gotcha. And I imagine it's different, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine it's different based on which health system you're at the time. But what departments do you find yourself interacting with most frequently?
It's always nursing, I think we interact with most. I think we always wish that we had more interaction and engagement with physicians. And then I think the department we just naturally partner a lot with, and that there's mutual appreciation of each other's roles and value is environmental services. I've always felt like there could be a world where environmental services reports to infection prevention, because I'm like, that's what they're there for, right? To prevent cross-contamination. And so that's always an area where we work closely.
Gotcha. Okay. And then back to your kind of career trajectory. You stayed in that regional director role for almost 4 years and then ended up where you are now as a network director. Tell me the scope that you had 3 hospitals there. And then when you took your position now, how many hospitals did that put you over?
Yeah. So in the previous role, it was 3 hospitals in the city, but it was also 3 rural hospitals as well. And so in moving to my current position, it was 6 hospitals, but they're all 6 larger facilities in the city. So I think the scope of services, the resources, the patient population types, all that just was larger, greater than my previous role.
Gotcha. So what motivated that transition for you? Was it just a bigger scope, a new challenge, or was there something more there that kind of had you interested in transitioning at that point?
Yeah, I think it was looking for a place where I would be able to grow even further. And also personally, I just always wanted to, I'm let's try this type of person. And so Arizona was never on my radar, but when they reached out, I'm open to exploring new ideas and possibilities. And so I came out And it was just a really nice, welcoming atmosphere. The weather was nice. The people were nice. It just felt like a really good fit and a place where I could bring my talents and my expertise and they would be valued and I would have new opportunities and also be able to help the organization in their goals and endeavors.
Yeah. Awesome. And you didn't last long with the network director title. I mean, it was about a year before they bumped you up to an AVP. So there's not a ton of IP positions that have, or health systems that have an AVP title for infection prevention. So I'm wondering, how did that come to be? Was that something that you were an advocate for and fighting for? Was that something that just kind of fell in your lap and you said yes? Was it something that COVID kind of just launched you into it and they thought somebody needed to be at that level? Or what transpired to give you that AVP title?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was, I think, a myriad of factors, but I also think it was, largely based on the organization's kind of titling processes and looking at different roles and what the appropriate level of leadership was for that role. So I definitely wouldn't say it's necessarily something that I advocated for. I'd like to believe it's something that the level at which I worked and the results that I contributed to show that it wasn't, just a director role, that it was a more senior level role. But it was also definitely based on just the organization's efforts around structure.
That's phenomenal. And then you did that for several years too. So I'm curious, how big of a challenge was this? I mean, you kept the same amount of hospitals, it sounds like, but it was different. And there's probably more services involved too. Was it, how big of a transition was this for you?
I think it was a pretty large transition. And I think the biggest change was also the amount of ambulatory outpatient sites. So, the organization I'm at has probably over 200 now and had close, at least 100, 140, 150 at that time. So I think just the footprint is larger and further into the professional evolution of infection prevention, just who's on your team and the level that everyone's working at, So I've been in this, like I said, for 15 years now. I have a team that's very talented, very ambitious, and the expectations from organizations, from CMS, from other like federal agencies, professional agencies out there, everything is heightened and amplified. So you're not really just doing the same thing you were 15 years ago. The expectations are far greater and the impact is definitely more scrutinized. So I think it's been a challenge, like a welcome, positive challenge, but it's been work. And like you said, it's been during COVID predominantly as well.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about COVID I don't want to spend too long on it because I know you guys were in the thick of it for too long and probably just want that to be done with. But I mean, it wasn't too long you were in this role before COVID hit. So, I mean, did it totally just consume your role for a year and then you had to essentially relearn what that role actually looks like? Is that kind of what went down?
I would say it did consume my role, but it also allowed infection prevention to be in the spotlight for how we can support our organization, how we can help protect patients, how we can help protect staff members. And I'm a big believer in never let a good crisis go to waste, right? So if we can introduce concepts, if we can introduce policies and approaches that have value at that time, then I think what it shows and what it has done for us is we now have that almost political capital a few years later where I believe there's more trust in our recommendations. There's more understanding and value in what we bring to the table. So I think it's helped open a lot of doors and then with the right conversations and efforts, hopefully kept them open so that we can be more effective in everything else as well.
Gotcha. And then here recently, like in the last year or so, it looks like you added health equity to your role. So what is that and how did that come about?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, like I said, my background, I've always been driven and passionate about eliminating health disparities, about health equity, community health, public health. And so I think during COVID, it allowed the opportunity to merge both of those interests for me personally. So there was vaccine equity, and I really started sliding over and offering support in that realm. So COVID pop up clinics, um,
Hmm.
chairing and leading conversations about supporting vulnerable populations during COVID. And so I think those conversations really continued once that crisis stabilized. So health inequities, what it looks like in our organization and how our data displays that for our leaders. And so being over infection prevention, it's a really nice area where I can apply those concepts to infection prevention because we know that it's not excluded from those concerns. There are disparities in, who develops a UTI, who develops a surgical site infection, receiving patient education, caregiver information in preferred language, health literacy challenges. So it's all just as applicable in infection prevention. So applying it in that space, but also supporting the organization and the professional organization, APIC, in evolving the health equity agenda as well.
Yeah. And let's talk about APIC for a second, because you're involved with that organization, and it's obviously a big deal to many IPs, and we point really everybody we know to that organization for all sorts of things. But when did you get involved with APIC, and would you recommend others do that early in their career or just whenever?
Yeah. I've been involved in APIC since I started in infection prevention. The Houston chapter, when I was there, was very robust. And even if you weren't on the board, right, it was a good place to go monthly, get a good lunch, learn something new, have fellowship, make connections. So I've always been involved in APIC. And then a couple years ago, like I said, as I started to reconnect with my passion around health equity, health disparities, I presented at National APIC on just what does that look like? What does it look like, the intersection of these two practices or concerns? And out of that came, conversations evolved, and I joined APIC's Health Equity Committee. And so I've been serving on that committee for approximately the last year.
Okay. And then have you done, and I really don't know this, but I know it's pretty popular for a lot of people at your level to get involved with presentations and publications and different things. Have you dove into that at all in your career?
Yeah, I've partnered on one or two publications and definitely done some presentations as well. And I think that's the challenging part is having time to do that. That takes a lot of time. And, many infection prevention departments are just understaffed for the outcomes they're expected to support. And there has to be an intentional decision about where you're going to put your time and efforts. And personally, that's not something that I have dedicated as much time to up to this point in my career. And I've often discussed with my team, we really need to be strategic and scale back maybe some of our endeavors to spend time sharing all the good work that we're doing, to write, to publish, but that takes resources, that takes time. And it almost feels like you're either writing and publishing or you're doing, but it's very hard to do both.
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. And I want to focus more real quick on the non-nurse background. When I started recruiting back in 2012, it was pretty uncommon for a non-nurse to be in it. Now things are trending what I would say is the right direction. And you see much more backgrounds involved. But I'm curious, it didn't sound like it, but I want to ask specifically, did you feel any sort of, I guess, challenge in any of your roles being a non-nurse? Or did every place you've been and work and people you interact with, did they just, give you the credit that you deserve?
Definitely not the latter. I would say before I landed the infection prevention role, there was about 6 to 9 months, and I knew I wanted to go into healthcare. I knew I was looking for a very specific role within a healthcare organization where even though I had just completed my master's, I thought about going back and just getting my RN, just to get into healthcare, because it felt like even for non-direct care roles, they only wanted nurses. So I think that was probably when I felt it most, was just trying to enter healthcare. Once I was able to move into this infection prevention role, I definitely encountered individuals who made me feel that way, right? Who didn't see the value or had just an inherent distrust because they didn't see me as a clinician. But just through evolution and just time in the role and my ability to speak to and understand my role and how clinical care works from an IP perspective, that's, I don't feel like any longer an issue, but it's definitely something I had to work through with certain individuals early in my career.
Gotcha. Yeah. And tell me this, I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but do you think any background is more, I mean, let's take a step back. Like, anyone that goes into this role has to learn a lot of the role on the job. I mean, if you're a non-nurse, you're going to have to learn the clinical piece. If you're a nurse, you're going to have to learn the epidemiology piece or the scientific piece. Do you see the learning curve as more challenging for one background or another, or is it just different?
I definitely feel as though it probably feels more familiar, certain aspects of it, for someone who's coming from a nursing background, actually practicing nursing background, or from like the lab background. There are just some things you're going to just understand better. You're super familiar with the processes, in the lab or specific, even a CSPD background. I have a team member whose background is CSPD, and that's amazing because it's so specific. But I also am of the belief that everything, no matter who, even those individuals, they weren't at one point nurses, they weren't at one point, laboratorians, right? You have to learn, you have to be taught. And so I feel like as long as someone is willing to learn and be taught, anyone, can be in infection prevention. I think it's a passion for the work and a commitment to the craft. I think there are certain backgrounds that just make it a little bit smoother entry into the field.
Yeah. And then let's talk about that. I mean, obviously in your position, I mean, how many people do you have underneath you? Maybe not direct reports, but how many people in the IP department do you have?
I think right now it's 13, 14. We're making some changes.
So you've been, So you've been in your fair share of interviews and hiring and whatnot. I want to know your hiring philosophy. I mean, you mentioned it. I mean, clearly you want a diverse team. But do you have any preference on backgrounds, or what backgrounds do you maybe favor, or what do you look for when you go to hire an IP?
I don't favor any. I would say my North Star is diversity. So if I am looking for a certain background, when I'm in a hiring round, it's based on what's currently on my team and what I feel like our team needs. It's not based on a preference overall for that background, and so I'm looking for someone that I can work with personally, right? Someone that wants to work with me. That's really important. Someone who feels like they will fit into the culture of the team, but also elevate the teamwork, bring positivity. Someone who's ambitious and shows grit. I think that doesn't always come through in an interview, or sometimes it's very hard to get people to find an example or speak to what you're asking, but just really that determination to be in this field, that determination to apply these concepts in a way that improve patient safety is something that I'm looking for. And then true interest in the infection prevention field. Because if you're not already certified with years of experience, bringing someone into IP is a huge investment. So I'm fine if you're, like I said, not certified, don't have years in the field, but I really need to know that you are 100% all in for infection prevention for at least a couple of years to flush it out and see if this is a true career path for you.
Gotcha. And what do you, as far as personality traits go, what do you look for? I mean, like I said, you've been in your fair share of interviews. Are there any specific personality traits that you like pinpoint and you can just say, okay, yeah, they're going to be a star one day, or they're going to, like, infection prevention is made for them? Like, what is it? What personality traits do you look for, or what have you seen do really well?
The people that are that feel borderline obsessed with getting an infection prevention, where they're just like, I've done this internship and I've done this, like, where they're just 100% in. You can tell they've identified this role. And even if they don't have any experience, they already are familiar with APIC. They've already started to prepare and read the certification, manuals and books. And people that really seem to have really strong interpersonal skills. They can read a room, they can adjust, because so much of infection prevention is about winning people over before you get to the work. So if they're not able to build that rapport, to be able to maybe even adjust to our team when we're interviewing them and pull people in when they're losing them, then it's probably not going to be a good fit. If it feels like they're giving me a lecture during the interview, like they're providing a presentation, that's probably not going to be a good fit.
So tell me, let's do this. I mean, we're getting close to the end of time, so I kind of want to ask one final question that I've got here, but it's not even a question. I want to give you the chance. I mean, most people listening to this are people either just getting into infection prevention or wanting to actively grow. What advice or what would you share with them, either encourage them with where they're at if they're dealing with burnout, or if they're just entertaining the idea of getting into the field? What any sort of insight or advice you could provide those folks?
Yeah. So if you're interested in getting into the field, I would say just find an entry point, right? I think sometimes people want to be here, they want to be there. I would say just be open to any type of setting that gets you in the door, because it's still not a very large community. Like, it's large in total number, but there's just not a lot of opportunities out there. And so I wouldn't be too particular about the location you're at or the site. Like, get your foot in the door, be able to start to do the work. That's really important. And then when you're into it, I would say show yourself so much grace, like hold yourself accountable, but show yourself so much grace. There's so much to learn that you have no idea. Even if you think, that first year, you're going to learn so much more than you realize. So show yourself grace. And I think be very ambitious, be very aggressive with taking in this information, learning these concepts, and internalizing them and applying them in all you do in those first couple years. And I think for anyone experiencing burnout, I would probably say it's time to pursue other options, not outside of IP, but maybe in different settings, maybe working with different departments, working with different people. It's time to change up the scenery a little bit, because I mean, there have definitely been times in my career where I was like, do I really want to do this? But then you work with different people, you get on a different project, and you have that renewed interest and passion. And so I would say just change it up. You don't have to just trudge through it. There's so much to do in this space.
No, that's really good advice. And let me actually ask one more question. You referenced just that you learned that most IP or hospital systems are understaffed in their IP department. So I'm curious, and there's always more room for IPs, and I think everybody in this field understands that. But do you have a number that you shoot for, like a ratio of infection prevention to beds? I mean, there's different reports or whatever that have come out that kind of give advice, but do you have anything that you live by, or any goal that you have that you just shoot for, or is it totally dependent on the situation and the services each hospital provides?
I think up until this point, I usually rely on the APIC recommendations from that perspective. They put out studies, intermittently, or guidance. And so the most recent guidance was the 1:69 bed, ratio, until the most recent APIC staffing calculator came out, which is a little bit more customized. But I think for me, it's really the workload and expectations of that organization compared to their staffing. And is it realistic, and is it supportive of the individuals that are in these roles? So if you just want infection prevention rounding and doing education, and you have streamlined or centralized surveillance, and there's no expectations for outpatient ambulatory. Like if you carve out some of the work, all that matters, you know. And I think I've just been having conversations really with leaders to just understand that infection prevention is such a comprehensive role. We do all of the surveillance, right? We do all the abstraction, right? Other departments have whole abstraction teams. We do the process improvement. We do the patient safety huddles. We do the education and training. So I feel like if you want it all, you have to staff up. And if you don't, even if you're not having those conversations, like certain things are going to have to be put on the back burner. It'll just happen. And it has to be calibrated according to what's expected to be delivered.
Gotcha. Makes sense. All right.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Voice for Infection Prevention. We hope you found our discussions informative and insightful. Remember to subscribe to our podcast for more conversations with experts in the field, and don't forget to leave us a review to let us know what you think. For additional resources and to stay updated on the latest news in infection prevention, visit our website at voiceforip.com. Thank you again for listening. Until next time, stay safe and continue your commitment to excellence in infection prevention.